Hi everyone, my name is Josh, and here with me is Sydney, Connor, and Will. We're the trauma team from INT314, and today we're going to be discussing films and how traumatic events shape the characters' views of their own identities.
To start our discussion, we're going to start with the 2016 film Manchester by the Sea, directed by Kenneth Lonergan. This film tells the story of Lee Chandler, who's played by Casey Affleck, who becomes the legal guardian of his nephew Patrick after his brother dies of heart complications. As the film unravels, we learn about Lee's traumatic past, in which he had issues with drugs and drinking and partying, and he ended up setting a house fire, and he ended up losing his 3 children. Living with that guilt and grief completely consumes Lee, and he finds himself unable to care for his nephew that he is now the legal guardian for. To open up our team discussion, I would like to ask how you guys think that trauma was portrayed in this film.
So Lee, who essentially is the main character in Manchester by the Sea, lives a very sad life. In the movie, he started off as a janitor. We see that he's very insecure, seems very mad at the world.
I think that Lee is definitely like a more quiet character, for sure. He doesn't really talk. I think that his grief and sadness is communicated through other things in the film. For example, like the color scheme. Like everything that happens after his traumatic event occurred with his house burning down. Everything got really dark. The sun hardly ever shines. The clothing he wears is all really dark. And I actually have a source here. It's the analysis of traumatic narrative styles. Zhang expresses the protagonist's emotion through color. And he says that the color scheme in the movie is a very rich emotion, actually, which I think is a great point.
And it's a stark contrast to all the flashbacks that are really colorful, really sunny. He's wearing bright clothing, he's laughing, he's smiling, he's hanging out with his friends.
Yeah.
And after that event, his entire worldview just changes. His view of himself changes, almost as if he doesn't think he has much to contribute at all. And so he's not putting himself out there anymore.
Yeah, there's even a change in the tone of his voice is something that I really noticed. In some of the older clips before that event of his house burning down, he's much more of a sarcastic tone, kind of jokes around with people around him, with his friends. In the beginning, you see him joking around with his nephew on the boat, who he ends up taking in as kind of his own son throughout the story. And after all these events happen, just completely changes his view on life. His tone is completely different. It's shallow. It's very monotone. And pretty much he just sounds like he's constantly disinterested or disassociated with any conversation that he's in, because there's just this specific vocal inflection that he does, which Casey Affleck does with the character, that just sounds so sad that even just replaying clips of the movie, you can just tell that is a man going through just an immense amount of trauma or everything that he's experienced, and how he just doesn't see life in a similar way, which really shows how his identity of himself and how he views his life completely changed after those events.
You want to join us? I made way too much.
Oh. Well, that's all right.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, he doesn't say a whole lot in the movie, but he has one specific line where Patrick is essentially asking him, why can't you stay in Manchester, which is the place where this traumatic event happened to him. And he only says 4 words, but he just says, I can't beat this. And he says it twice. And it really tells you everything you have to know. He's obviously struggling. He can't get away from it. He can't escape it. And it really just shows how damaged he is.
Yeah, that association to the place.
I can't beat it. I can't beat it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I also think that particular scene also serves as a pivotal moment that I think it starts to show the healing process. I think the fact that he even says that to Patrick, is willing to say that to Patrick, a turning point in like how he's dealing with the trauma. Because beforehand he wasn't really dealing with it. He was just existing, going through the motions. But here he's this is the first time he's like actually verbally admitted to someone why he can't go back, and like that it's still haunting him. So I think that serves as a really good point of, it shows that he's healing, right? You know, the movie doesn't have this super happy ending, but it does show us, the viewer, that, you know, he's healing, right? He's willing to heal. So I think it shows how important people are to helping other people go through the trauma and building back their lives to as close as to what it was before as they could possibly hope for.
And Josh, when you were talking about like the ending not being happy, I think that they did a good job of portraying what grief and traumatic events actually feel like, because most of the time there's not a big happy resolution at the end. That's not really the way that life works. And they did that well. I mean, they kind of just left it up for interpretation about what happens next. Like, we don't know if he ever, you know, goes to therapy and starts dealing with his issues. We don't know if he ends up moving to Manchester to be with his nephew. Like, there's not really anything there. And I just think that's really telling about the real world. And I have another source here that's from the Journal of Contemporary Film. And they talked about how the lack of resolution, it shows like the deepest and most powerful cinematic reflections of grief and mourning, of how like there's not really any big happy resolution at the end, you know? And I think that's really powerful and realistic, because like in film a lot, I think we see things that are like, well, that wouldn't actually happen, or that's not really.
It's always like, you know, the good guy wins, they beat the villain or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
And this one, it's the whole, this is probably the most like real movie that I've ever watched. Like, it in a way it made it even more, you know, hard to sit through, in a way of like just feeling so much emotion, because it feels so real. It's almost a bit eerie.
Our next film, Grave of the Fireflies, is a 1980s Japanese animated historical war drama that follows two siblings as they try and eke out a living in World War II Japan. In 1940, the Japanese government established a rationing system, but pretty quickly things got bleak, especially for the large cities such as Tokyo and Kobe, with Kobe being the city where this story takes place, as they're 100% reliant on the Japanese government's rations. The film is loosely based on the autobiography of Akiyuki Nosaka, who cites his guilt for not taking better care of his sister and letting her die of malnutrition as the impetus for writing his story, which this was then adapted to this movie of the same name, Grave of the Fireflies. So, to start, what do you guys think of this movie?
Well, in general, this is probably one of the saddest movies I've like ever seen in my life. But in terms of trauma, I think this movie does a really good job of taking the different route of showing what happens when you take on the toll of like someone else's trauma. Because in the terms of this movie, the younger sister, she doesn't really know what's going on. She's at the age where she knows all these bad things are happening, but she doesn't know why. She doesn't necessarily know why. She doesn't see her mom or her dad anymore. And her older brother takes on that role of trying to shelter her from all of that. And in his eyes, that's the best thing he can do for her, which, whether that be right or wrong, doesn't really matter, I guess. But I think there's just a lot to say about taking on the toll of someone else's trauma.
Yeah, and it definitely becomes, I think, he becomes very prideful, right? Instead of seeking the help of others, he and his sister live with their aunts, but after the aunt becomes resentful, he thinks that he can make it out better by himself. And it's not like just because he wants to go by himself, but because he thinks he can do better. And he lets that pride cloud him, and that's, I think, maybe even a symptom of shouldering that trauma.
Yeah, I think his role in life, kind of as we've discussed already, just like changes into more of like a father figure. And I think a big part of that is because their father, who's fighting in the war, is gone. So I think he just kind of sees that he has to become that, because he gets so focused on feeling like he needs to provide for her and everything like they do in life.
Like he
provide
alone.
shelter.
He alone.
Yeah, like he alone is the only one that can do it. He resorts to stealing food, which gets them in danger at times. In a way, it's growing this bond between them, but also I think it distracts him from their overall like physical and like mental health, because I think in his eyes, at least in my opinion, it seemed like him becoming this father figure was his way of trying to forget what had just happened to them, and maybe like trying to distract Seda as well,
right?
From what they had just been through, which kind of like you said, almost kind of led to her death, because when she died, he was out trying to get food.
Yeah.
And even though she had shown obvious signs of most likely dying within like the next hours or like day.
Yeah.
And so instead of staying with her, he was like, I still have to provide for her. So then he left. So I think he kind of got stuck in that needing to provide, which is why I think when we see kind of his second identity shift after she dies, he kind of falls into a like deep depression of, this is my fault. I now have nothing. My mother's dead. My father isn't, we have no idea what he's going on. Like, we haven't heard from him. He's in the war. My sister's now dead. I have no role. And he just quite literally rots in a subway.
I think what you're saying, Will, makes a lot of sense, and I think they represent well what happens like when you lose your sense of identity. Because like you said, his identity was her caretaker, making sure that she stayed alive. And after she dies, he's like, well, what do I do now? Like, that was my entire life, essentially. And now I don't have that. Who am I?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how you see in a lot of these other movies that we watched, or most of them, like maybe if not all of them outside of this one, the character that we mainly focus on in their trauma, it kind of just changes once and then it's continuous throughout the movie. This one, it's interesting because you see it change once and then towards the end you see it change again.
Yeah.
And he's almost like three people in one movie, from just like a child with a family to having to be a father figure at a very young age to then just feeling like nothing. And I thought that was very interesting and extremely sad, obviously, as this all had a very emotional toll on all of us, I believe, when we watched it.
And I think with the little girl, kind of what she was going through throughout the whole movie was a lot of confusion. She was just, her role, her identity, she was just a kid. She was just growing up trying to live a normal, happy life. Obviously, it was very hard during this time. There's a scene where kind of Grave of the Fireflies, where this title comes from, is she finds joy in these fireflies. They're out late at night, her and her brother Setsuko, and they're catching these fireflies, having lots of fun to kind of just counteract with the trauma, what's going on, what they're dealing with. And there's actually also a scene where Seita sees a girl, probably about her age, reunited with her mom during the war, and her expression on Seita's face, she's very just sad. She wants that. She doesn't know where her mom is. She wants to be with her.
I think that was I wouldn't say that scene caused me to become the most teary, but that was like, I think fundamentally like one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the movie, because she just wants to be with her mother and she doesn't know why she can't. And she, in a way, it's almost like a good thing that she's so young that she doesn't have to like process all these, really complex and terrible emotions. She just isn't old enough to understand. It's almost like a blessing in disguise, which is in itself another very sad aspect of the movie. I think personally that the takeaway here is that there's a lot of danger in shouldering the trauma of more than one person, because you can really one person can only handle one person's trauma. If you try to take on more than that, it's not going to end up well, and you're not going to be able to make any progress.
So this next film is a film directed by Denis Villeneuve called Prisoners in 2013. It's a thriller headlined by Hugh Jackman, Jake Gyllenhaal, Paul Dano, and it covers a tragic story between two girls who are being kidnapped. Begins a full investigation led by Detective Loki, Jake Gyllenhaal. After the investigation looks to be heading in the wrong direction, the father of one of the girls being abducted Keller is his name, played by Hugh Jackman. He takes matters into his own hands. We will now open up the floor for discussion and explain how trauma is portrayed in this film. While I was doing some research on prisoners, I found an article called Family Member Response to Violent Infant Kidnapping. For some people, experiencing trauma and loss facilitated reevaluation of their values and goals. In this movie, an example that illustrates this is the father's identity and how his is changed throughout the film. In the early stages of the film, before the little girls got abducted, he's just a normal father looking out for his kids. And when we talk about the father taking matters into his own hand, he kind of lost himself a little bit in the film and abducted someone himself. He lost himself in the process, and obviously, I mean, what would you do in the situation? He's just trying to be a protective father and look out for his kids, but it just went way too far.
I think the biggest example for me in this movie is Holly. She's in this war against God, essentially, where she lost her son to cancer. And before that, she was a very devout Christian and she was super religious. And then after losing him, she kind of lost herself a bit and didn't understand, why was God punishing me? Why is this happening to me? From there, she ended up then kidnapping these families. I think that for her, it was well, if I can't be happy, no one's going to be. If I lose my kid, these families are going to lose their kids.
Making children disappear is the war we wage with God. Makes people lose their faith. Turns them into demons like you.
Yeah, I think really the crux of it in this movie is that trauma, in one way or another, serves as a catalyst to depravity. For our Hugh Jackman's character, it helps him internally justify what he's doing because it's for the greater good. It's a do the ends justify the means scenario, and I don't think they do, but you can definitely see why, and it's hard to blame him.
Yeah, and like I talked about earlier with Hugh Jackman in the movie and how he reacted to these traumatic events, I really think that the movie did an awesome job because as you're watching, you can kind of envision and play out scenarios in your head of what you might do or how you might react to certain traumatic events. So I think the movie does that pretty well.
Yeah, I think another pretty realistic way of how a lot of people would react to something like this going on in their lives, which is a little bit less of a kind of a Hollywood dramatification is how I view it, is the mother of one of the daughters who is abducted. She kind of just falls into a state of depression, and pretty much ever since the girl's kidnapped, we just see her in a bed having to take a bunch of prescribed drugs to deal with everything that she's going through.
Just completely catatonic.
So it's just another showing of how the trauma that someone is going through can really just completely change their outlook on life and what is essential to them. To her, it's that's all that was essential to her is her daughter being found, and so she just kind of, nothing else was a care in her world. It's just her. She wants to find her daughter, so she just falls into this depression and is doing nothing else with her life other than just worrying constantly, which pretty much anyone would do.
And to kind of back that up a little bit, this is another quote that I found during my research. It's an article called Family Functioning, Coping, and Psychological Adjustment in Victims and Their Families Following Kidnappings. The study examines the psychological after effects of kidnapping on families while being held captive as well as after. So the quote is, "The great stress that characterizes captivity led us to propose that psychological distress and PTSD in family members would be significantly higher during captivity than after the release." And a prime example of that was the mother, and on lots of drugs and medication and depressed up until the end, where when sorry for the spoilers, but where her daughter came back to her, it was kind of, you could see a spark in her eyes and this the expression on her face of just excitement and a sense of relief, knowing that, after going through all that, she's definitely made her a lot better.
But yeah, I feel like her character did just kind of completely change. The instant that her daughter was found and they were reunited, she was just like completely different, smiling, happy. She looked healthier, like physically, which, like you said, just completely backs up that research that you did.
Yeah, and I think what you had said, Will, about that is very telling, even in, like I said before, the case of Holly, how trauma affects someone's life in that way. Like, how do you go from being, a devout Christian and believing in God to then kidnapping children? Like, how does that work out? And she had a traumatic event happen to her, and I think it's just very telling to how trauma and situations like that can change people's identity right down to the core.
I would agree. I don't think anything else would cause that much of a 180.
And I feel like this movie does a great job overall of showing that in multiple different ways with multiple different characters, and is why it was such an interesting look and study on how, like our question poses, how trauma changes the identity of these characters in these films. So our final movie that we'll be discussing is the 2017 Best Picture winner Moonlight, which was released in 2016 and directed by Barry Jenkins. This movie stars Mahershala Ali, Trevante Woods, and Janelle Monáe as some of the bigger stars in this film. The film itself is a multi-chaptered story of the life of a young black man named Chiron, growing up in Miami and following his journey to manhood. He is guided by the community around him, which kind of helps to raise him throughout the different chapters of his life. And even when his story is at its most vulnerable state, they still help him through it, and we see that during the movie. We will open up our final group discussion on how this film portrays trauma and identity.
One thing I like about this movie is that it takes place over a longer period of time, so it feels more realistic in that sense, kind of. Manchester by the Sea also kind of did that with the flashbacks, but here you get to see it like chronologically as it happened, which I appreciated.
Yeah, it's probably one of the more unique movies I've ever watched. I don't think I've ever watched a movie that's structured in that way, where like it specifically says like Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Like there's a cut to black and it shows it through the different portions of his life.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of allows the movie also to feel like very personal and kind of like, I guess you could say it feels like lived in. Like you see just like this person's life. Like they have different characters that flash by through points of his life, but it's all on Chiron and his life. An article that I found about the movie specifically that did research on it by Luis M. Garcia Maynard in 2023 talks about how the movie has a unique stylistic choice of how you could call it like personal cinema, just based on how it focuses on this like intense personal point of view of the character Chiron, kind of like what I just mentioned, and his life and how trauma affects him and everything like that, how it relates to our question. And I think a big part of this personal story about him is relating to his sexuality, which was, I know for all of us, not at all what we expected. We went into this thinking that it was more going to be a traumatic story based on like the drug epidemic happening at the time.
That was my expectation.
Yeah, I think all of us were just like, all right, that's what we're going to talk about. And then the biggest point of trauma was relating to his sexuality.
In my opinion, a big character that had an influence on Chiron's life was Juan, and he was kind of like a father figure towards Chiron in the sense, Chiron, he didn't have a father growing up. He grew up with his mother, who was very abusive, she didn't care about him. She got drunk every night, was very drugged up. Juan kind of took him under his wing and taught him to stand up for himself, influenced him in a lot of positive ways that I think really helped shape Chiron's life.
Yeah, I think a really interesting portion of that first act of when he was called Little, he was at Juan's house, when Juan was kind of taking him under his wing, and he had mentioned the slur that people had been calling him as he was a little kid, just because he felt a little bit different. Obviously, I think we all know the slur, the F slur, for a lot of people who are a part of the LGBTQ+ community, and he had asked him what that slur means, and Juan kind of had to try to, in a fatherly way, explain it to him. And this is something that he had never, like, he's experiencing this just as like a little kid, like just in elementary school, dealing with this slur at such a young age, and having to question what that means to him, and asking if he is the embodiment of what that slur means.
What's a f***?
A faggot is a word used to make gay people feel bad.
Am I a faggot?
No. No. You could be gay, but you never let nobody call you no faggot.
And so I think from his youth, you see the way that he's going through this, the road of kind of figuring himself out. And something else that I found in another article through my research kind of preparing for this is in a study done by Alex Smith and Melissa Platt in 2018, they found that LGBTQ plus youth are found to experience more trauma both in childhood and while homeless in adolescence than their heterosexual peers. Chiron wasn't necessarily homeless, but due to the fact that he didn't have a father and the place that he called home had, like you said, an abusive mother, someone who was constantly on drugs, drunk, and didn't really treat him like a true son. I feel like it just kind of relates to that quote really well and that study really well.
There's a big scene later in the movie where Sharon gets beaten up very badly from his best friend, Kevin. We transition forward kind of later. That was kind of the end of his teenage years that we saw him in the movie. And then fast forward later on, he, as an adult, he looks a lot physically stronger. You know, physically he was changed. I think that could have had an influence on him to change his body, but he never changed who he was as a person.
Yeah, and I want to bounce back to Will's point about Sharon's home, or really I would say lack thereof, because I wouldn't say that's a home. That was more of a shelter.
Yeah.
Just a place to hide from the rain. And I think a common theme between 3 of these 4 movies is the lack of a safe place to process the trauma, to deal with the trauma. I think the odd one out would be Manchester. I think Lee's family was more or less present for him, but he, chose isolation. But in these 3 other movies, in Grave, The Fireflies, and Moonlight, and Prisoners, none of these main characters had a really good space to process their trauma, to talk about it, to open up with other people. And it really makes, I wonder how much these movies would have changed if these people had the facilities, the people to talk to and to try and process this. Because in a lot of these movies, these characters are by themselves. They have to do it themselves. And I just think that's really unhealthy and really only makes it worse.
Yeah, and going off of that, this movie specifically really shows how unresolved trauma follows you throughout your life. It doesn't just go away. Once you have that time and space to deal with what you're experiencing, to deal with trauma, to process it, to work through it, then it can be resolved in some aspects. And I think they did a really good job of showing that, when he was able to meet up with Kevin again later in life and talk about it.
Yeah, because throughout the story you saw that personal connection with Kevin, his friend, that he didn't have with really anybody else. And obviously because Juan, the father figure that we talk about, only appears in the first act when he's a kid. And so to have that repeated connection with Kevin, and to show, kind of like what you mentioned earlier as well, this is the point where he's physically bulked up, he's physically different, but when he's around Kevin, the only person he's really been able to consistently feel vulnerable with, he then reverts back to that shy kid. And so I just thought that it was interesting that the only person he was really able to consistently stay himself around through this trauma was Kevin.
It's really the one movie that I feel had a mostly happy ending. All the other ones were pretty
Yeah,
I don't know how I'd rank them, but this one made me feel a little better. I didn't feel terrible after
you left and you were
movie.
just terribly depressed.
Yeah.
This one was more okay, he found his person. He's finally able to feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Well, to close this out, I just want to say on behalf of the Film Trauma Group, thank you for watching.